They spent my wedding fund on my brother's bail. I had the bank statements. I want to start with that sentence, because for 6 years, every dollar I set aside for my wedding day represented something my family had taught me never to expect from them. Stability. The idea that if I did everything right, worked hard enough, saved carefully enough, I could build something of my own that no one could quietly take away from me. I was wrong about that, and I want to tell you exactly how I found out, because I think, if you've ever been the responsible one in a family that mistook your responsibility for an unlimited resource, you already understand where this story is headed. Hello and welcome. This is a quiet place for stories about the moments people finally stop absorbing what was never fairly asked of them, and start, instead, protecting what they built with their own 2 hands. If any part of this story sounds familiar to you, I hope you'll stay until the end, because I think how this one resolves might surprise you. My name is Emma. I am 30 years old, and 6 years ago, I opened a savings account with an initial deposit of $200, money I'd received as a birthday gift from an aunt who has since passed away. I called it, in the little label field, the bank lets you add to an account, simply, wedding. I wasn't engaged yet. I didn't even have a serious boyfriend at the time. But I had watched enough weddings in my extended family unfold in a scramble of last-minute credit card debt and parental resentment. And I had decided, quietly, at 24 years old, that when my turn came, I would walk into that day owing nothing to anyone. I remember the exact afternoon I opened that account, a Saturday in early spring, sitting in a small branch 3 blocks from my apartment while a young bank teller, not much older than I was at the time, asked me what the account was for. I told her, a little self-consciously, that it was for a wedding that didn't exist yet, for a person I hadn't met, on a date I couldn't have named. She smiled, kindly, and told me she thought that was one of the more hopeful things she'd heard that week. I didn't think much of the comment at the time. I think about it often now, given everything that eventually happened to that hopeful little account. I want to tell you about my family first, because I think the shape of what happened only makes sense once you understand the shape of the people involved. My mother Diane raised my younger brother Tyler and me largely on her own after my father left when I was 9. She worked 2 jobs for most of my childhood, a receptionist position during the day and cleaning offices 3 nights a week, and I have never once doubted that she loved us both fiercely. But there is a particular kind of exhaustion that settles into a single parent over decades of scarcity, and in my mother's case, that exhaustion expressed itself as an unshakable belief that whatever one of her children had, the family as a whole was entitled to share in, whether that child had agreed to share it or not. I remember as a child watching her divide a single grocery haul with an almost mathematical precision, 1 apple each, 1 portion of meat each, everything measured out so that no one, especially not herself, ever went without while someone else had more. I think looking back now, that this early necessary fairness, born entirely out of scarcity rather than any philosophy, eventually calcified into something else entirely once real money finally entered the family's life. The instinct to divide everything equally among the children never fully updated itself to account for the fact that, as an adult, what I had built was not a shared family resource waiting to be divided, but something I had built alone, for a specific purpose, with money that had never touched anyone else's hands. Tyler is 4 years younger than me, and he has spent most of his adult life in a kind of low-grade financial chaos that the rest of the family learned, slowly, to simply absorb rather than address. Missed rent covered quietly by our mother. A car loan co-signed by an uncle who never fully recovered the payments Tyler promised to make. A string of jobs he left, one after another, each departure narrated by Tyler himself as unfair treatment by employers who simply didn't understand his potential. I loved my brother. I want to say that clearly, because everything that follows might make it sound otherwise. But I had also spent 3 decades watching a pattern repeat itself so consistently that I could have set a clock by it, and some part of me, even before any of this happened, had begun quietly bracing for the version of that pattern that would eventually involve me directly. I remember one particular Thanksgiving when I was 26 and Tyler was 22, sitting around my mother's small dining table while she quietly slipped him an envelope of cash under the tablecloth, thinking none of us noticed, to cover a phone bill he'd let lapse for 2 months. I said nothing that day. I had already learned by then that pointing out the pattern out loud only ever resulted in my mother growing defensive and Tyler growing sullen, and the family dinner, whatever else it was, would grow tense in a way that never actually changed anything about the underlying behavior. I filed it away instead, the way I filed away most of what I noticed in that family, quietly, without comment, telling myself it wasn't my business how my mother chose to spend her own money on her own son. What I didn't fully understand, not yet, was that the same instinct that let me stay quiet at that Thanksgiving table would eventually make me the kind of daughter my mother felt she could simply take from, rather than the kind she needed to ask. I started nursing school at 22, and by the time I turned 26, I was working full-time in a busy hospital's intensive care unit, a job that paid decently but demanded more from me, emotionally and physically, than almost anyone outside that field truly understands. I picked up extra shifts whenever I could. I lived, for the first 3 years after graduating, in a small one-bedroom apartment I shared with a roommate, driving a car with almost 200,000 miles on it because every spare dollar I could set aside went into that wedding account, growing slowly, steadily, the way careful things grow when you tend to them consistently over years, instead of hoping for them to happen all at once. I remember the specific discipline that fund required, because I think it matters for understanding exactly what was taken from me later. I skipped a close friend's destination bachelorette party in the Bahamas because the airfare alone would have cost me $800 I had earmarked instead for that account. I drove my aging car through 2 more winters than I probably should have, patching a slow oil leak myself, with instructions from an online video rather than paying a mechanic, because every unnecessary repair bill felt like a direct withdrawal from a future I hadn't even fully pictured yet. I picked up so many overnight shifts during my 27th year that my own roommate joked she saw me more often asleep on the couch in scrubs than actually awake and dressed, a joke she made so often it eventually became a kind of running affectionate shorthand between us, her leaving a blanket draped over the back of the couch each night just in case I came home too exhausted to make it to my own bed. Every single one of those small sacrifices went, deliberately, methodically, into a savings account that I thought of, privately, as the one part of my life that no chaos, no emergency, no family crisis would ever be allowed to touch. By the time I met Marcus, 4 years ago, at a friend's barbecue where he spent most of the evening arguing good-naturedly with someone about the correct way to smoke brisket, that account held just over $11,000. I remember telling him about the account on our 3rd date, half expecting the admission to seem strange, an oddly specific detail to share so early with someone I barely knew, but he simply nodded and said he thought it was one of the most sensible things he'd ever heard a person do, a comment that, looking back, told me quite a bit about the kind of steady, grounded partner he would eventually become. By the time he proposed, 2.5 years later, at the small lake house his family rented every summer, kneeling on the dock as the sun set behind him in a way that still makes my chest tighten a little whenever I think about it, that account held closer to $30,000. We spent the following months planning carefully, deliberately, choosing a venue we both loved, a boutique event space with a stone courtyard and string lights strung between old oak trees, exactly the kind of setting I had pictured, in some vague, unformed way, since I was a teenager watching other people's weddings unfold in scrambled, debt-fueled chaos. And by the spring of this year, 18 months into our engagement, 3 months before our wedding date, it held $47,300, the accumulated result of 6 years of double shifts, skipped vacations, and a stubborn private refusal to let my family's financial chaos become my own. I want to pause here and tell you about the access to that account, because it matters enormously for everything that follows. When I first opened it, at 24, still living partly under my mother's insurance and still, in some practical ways, entangled in her financial life, she had asked to be added to the account as a secondary signer, in case, she said, anything ever happened to me, and the family needed access to handle things. I was 24. I didn't think much of it. It seemed like the kind of reasonable precaution a mother might request, and refusing felt, at the time, like an insult I wasn't prepared to deliver. I signed the paperwork at the bank without much thought, and for the following 6 years, that access sat there, unused, a small forgotten detail in the architecture of an account I had otherwise built entirely on my own. I think, if I'm honest with myself now, some part of me even found a strange comfort in that arrangement back then. A 24-year-old's quiet reassurance that if anything catastrophic happened to me, my mother could step in and handle things without the added bureaucratic delay of proving her relationship to a bank that had never met her. I never once imagined that same access would eventually be used, not in the aftermath of some catastrophe befalling me, but as a quiet, ongoing solution to a series of catastrophes befalling someone else entirely, funded by money I had never intended for anyone but myself. I want to tell you about the night everything changed, because I remember it with the kind of clarity that only comes from moments that reorganize your entire understanding of the people you love. It was a Tuesday in April, close to 11 at night, and I had just finished a brutal 12-hour shift, the kind where you're not entirely sure, walking to your car afterward, whether your legs are going to hold you all the way there. My phone rang before I'd even started the engine. It was my mother, her voice tight with a particular kind of panic I recognized instantly, because I had heard versions of it before, throughout my entire adult life, always connected to my brother. I remember the parking lot that night with unusual clarity, the flickering fluorescent light above the employee entrance that had needed replacing for months, the distant sound of an ambulance arriving at the emergency bay on the other side of the building, a sound so constant in my working life that I barely noticed it most days, but that night, somehow, cut through everything else with an unpleasant sharpness. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine still off, my mother's voice growing more frantic in my ear, and I felt the particular familiar tightening in my chest that I had come to associate, over the years, with any phone call from her that began with the words, "Emma, I need to tell you something about your brother." Tyler had been arrested. A DUI, his second, compounded by an outstanding warrant related to a debt he owed a man my mother described only as someone Tyler got mixed up with. A debt significant enough that the same man had apparently shown up at Tyler's apartment twice in the preceding week, making threats vague enough to avoid being clearly reported to police, but specific enough that Tyler had moved out of that apartment entirely and was now sleeping on my mother's couch. Bail had been set at $12,000. My mother, her voice cracking in a way I had rarely heard in 30 years of watching her manage crisis after crisis, with a kind of grim, practiced calm, asked me if there was any way I could help. I sat in my car in that hospital parking lot for a long time before I answered her. I want to be honest with you about that moment, because I think it's important. I did not immediately think about my wedding fund. I thought about my brother, sitting in a holding cell, frightened in a way his usual bravado couldn't quite cover. I thought about my mother, exhausted after 30 years of catching him every time he fell. And I thought, finally, reluctantly, about the fact that I had, sitting in an account with my name on it, exactly the amount of money needed to solve this particular crisis in a single transfer. I told her I would lend the family $12,000, on the explicit, clearly stated condition that it was a loan, not a gift, and that I expected it to be repaid within the year, in whatever installments made sense given everyone's circumstances. My mother agreed immediately, gratefully, tearfully, the way people agree to anything, in the exact moment they desperately need you to agree to it. I transferred the money the following morning. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, coffee going cold beside my laptop, watching the balance in my wedding account drop from $47,300 to $35,300, and telling myself, firmly, that this was a temporary dip, alone among family, the kind of thing responsible adults sometimes do for each other in genuine emergencies, and that I would see that money returned to me, gradually over the following months. For the next several weeks, life continued in its ordinary way. Tyler was released on bail. He moved back into his mother's house rather than his own apartment, citing safety concerns about the man he owed money to. I continued planning my wedding, meeting with a venue coordinator, tasting cake samples with Marcus on a Saturday afternoon. That remains, even now, one of my favorite memories of that entire spring. Before I knew what I was about to discover, I remember, during that same stretch of weeks, sending my mother a cheerful text about a dress fitting, attaching a photo, feeling, in that particular unguarded moment, genuinely grateful that our family had come together so quickly to help my brother, entirely unaware that the very account I'd drawn from to help him was at that exact moment, continuing to quietly empty itself in ways I hadn't authorized, and wouldn't discover for weeks. It was early May, almost exactly 5 weeks after that Tuesday night phone call, when I sat down to make the final deposit for our venue, a boutique event space that required the remaining balance 3 months before the ceremony date. I opened my banking app expecting to see roughly $34,000 remaining, accounting for the $12,000 I'd lent and a small amount of ordinary spending in the weeks since. I remember the exact circumstances of that evening, because I have replayed them so many times since. Marcus was in the kitchen behind me, humming along to something on the radio while he finished washing a pan from dinner, and I was sitting cross-legged on our couch with my laptop balanced on a throw pillow, feeling, if anything, a small flush of pride as I opened the banking app, ready to finally transfer the remaining venue balance and check one more enormous item off our wedding checklist. I had even texted the venue coordinator earlier that afternoon, confirming I'd have the payments sent by that evening, the kind of small, satisfied efficiency I'd built my entire adult identity around. The balance read $4,112. I remember staring at that number for what felt like a full minute, refreshing the app twice, certain I was looking at some kind of display error, some glitch in the bank system that would resolve itself the moment I logged out and logged back in. It didn't resolve. I pulled up the full transaction history instead. My hands, I noticed distantly, beginning to shake slightly as I scrolled, while Marcus, still humming in the kitchen, remained entirely unaware that the ground beneath our entire wedding plan had just silently shifted. There, in the weeks following my initial $12,000 transfer, were 4 additional withdrawals I had never authorized, never discussed, and never even been told about. $8,000 withdrawn in early April, 2 weeks after the bail payment, labeled in the bank's internal notes simply as family transfer. $11,000 withdrawn 10 days later, $9,000 more withdrawn the following week, and finally $4,000 withdrawn just 3 days before I sat down to make my venue payment, as though whoever was accessing that account had grown increasingly comfortable with the process, increasingly confident that I wasn't paying close enough attention to notice. $32,000, withdrawn from an account I had spent 6 years building, by someone with legal access to it that I had granted, thoughtlessly, at 24 years old, and had simply forgotten existed. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time that evening, the venue payment reminder still open in another tab on my laptop, and I felt something shift inside me that I still find difficult to fully describe. It wasn't only anger, though anger was certainly part of it. It was something closer to a very specific, very cold recalibration of everything I had believed, up to that exact moment, about how my family understood the difference between what was theirs and what was mine. I called my mother that night. I kept my voice level, deliberately, because I have learned, over the years, that the version of me who speaks calmly gets more honest answers than the version of me who screams. I asked her, directly, whether she knew anything about additional withdrawals from my account beyond the $12,000 I had explicitly agreed to lend. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, long enough that I understood, before she said a single word, that whatever answer was coming would not be the answer I was hoping for. I could hear, faintly, the sound of her kitchen television playing in the background, some evening program she'd clearly been half watching before my call interrupted whatever fragile calm she'd been sitting in, and I remember thinking, even in that moment of rising dread, How strange it was that ordinary domestic sounds could continue so unremarkably in the background of a conversation that was about to reorganize everything I understood about my family. She told me, finally, in the careful softened language people use when they've had time to rehearse an explanation they know won't fully hold up, that after the bail money, more problems had emerged. The man Tyler owed money to had escalated his threats. There had been a second, smaller debt to a different creditor that surfaced only after the first was addressed. There had been a month of rent for an apartment Tyler needed to secure quickly, away from the neighborhood where the threats had originated. Each expense, she explained, had felt urgent in its own moment, and each time, she said, she had told herself she would explain it to me properly once everything had settled down, once Tyler was finally, truly stable. I asked her, very quietly, why she hadn't simply called me and asked, the way she had that first Tuesday night, rather than accessing an account I didn't know she still had access to, and withdrawing money without a conversation. Her answer, when it came, is one I have turned over in my mind more times than I can count in the months since. She said, "Emma, you would have said no eventually. You always start setting boundaries once the first ask is done. I didn't think you'd understand how serious it had gotten if I called every single time." I want you to sit with that sentence the way I had to sit with it that night, because I think it reveals something important about how my family had come to see me over the years. Not as a person with her own life, her own plans, her own carefully built future, but as a resource to be managed strategically, asked for gradually rather than all at once, precisely because a gradual ask was less likely to trigger the boundary that a single, honest, large request might have. I did not raise my voice during that phone call. I want to be honest with you about how close I came to it, because there is a version of that night where I imagine myself screaming into the phone, demanding answers, threatening consequences I wasn't yet prepared to actually pursue. Instead, I told my mother I needed some time to think, and I hung up, and I sat at my kitchen table until nearly 2 a.m, going through every transaction in that account line by line, printing out statements, taking screenshots, building without fully realizing it in the moment, the first pieces of what would eventually become an undeniable record of exactly what had happened to 6 years of my life's savings. Marcus came over the following evening, and I showed him everything. I want to tell you about that conversation too, because his reaction mattered enormously to what happened next. He sat beside me at my kitchen table, reading through the printed statements slowly, methodically, the same careful attention he brought to everything from assembling furniture to reviewing a contract for his own work. And I remember watching his jaw tighten slightly as he reached the 4th unauthorized withdrawal, the same tightening I imagine my own face had made the night before, sitting alone with the same numbers. He didn't tell me to forgive my family and move on, the way I think some partners might have, eager to avoid the discomfort of a fiancé's family conflict spilling into their own future. He also didn't tell me to cut them off entirely on the spot, a reaction that would have felt, to me, too fast, to disconnect it from 30 years of complicated love that doesn't simply evaporate because of a single devastating betrayal. He listened, carefully, asked good questions, wanting to understand the full timeline, the exact wording of my original agreement to lend the $12,000. Whether I'd ever explicitly told my mother the account access from years earlier still existed. And then he said something that stayed with me through everything that followed. He said, "Whatever you decide to do about your family, I think you need to decide it based on facts, not on however guilty they manage to make you feel in the moment. Get the facts first, feel whatever you need to feel after that." I remember leaning against his shoulder for a long time after he said that, grateful, in a way I hadn't fully expected to be, that the person I was marrying understood the difference between supporting me emotionally and simply telling me what I wanted to hear. It was, I think, the moment I first understood that whatever happened with my family in the weeks ahead, I wasn't going to be navigating it entirely alone. I called the bank the following morning and requested a formal meeting with their fraud and disputes department, bringing with me every printed statement, every screenshot, and a clear, written timeline of the single explicit loan I had authorized versus the 4 additional withdrawals I had not. The bank's fraud investigator, a careful, unhurried woman named Patricia, walked me through the process slowly. Her office was small, tucked at the back of the branch behind a door marked simply Private Consultation, with a single window that looked out onto the parking lot rather than the street. And she had a habit, I noticed within the first few minutes, of repeating each key detail back to me before writing it down, as though she wanted to be certain the record she was building matched my own account exactly, without any drift or interpretation creeping in along the way. Because my mother remained a legally authorized signer on the account, the withdrawals themselves, from a purely technical standpoint, had not violated any banking regulation. She had the legal right to access those funds, whatever the moral weight of how she'd chosen to use that right. Patricia explained this part gently, clearly uncomfortable delivering news she could see was landing hard, and she paused, at one point, to slide a box of tissues across the desk toward me, the kind of small, practiced kindness that suggested this wasn't the first time she'd had to deliver this particular piece of information to someone sitting exactly where I was sitting. But Patricia also explained something I hadn't fully understood until that meeting. The bank's records, cross-referenced with signature verification on the original account authorization, could establish a clear, documented distinction between what I had explicitly consented to, in writing, through our text message exchange the night of the bail payment, and what had happened afterward, entirely without my knowledge or consent, a distinction that, while not necessarily a banking fraud case in the strictest sense, created exactly the kind of paper trail that would matter enormously in any conversation, legal or otherwise, about what my family actually owed me. Patricia printed, at my request, a complete certified transaction history for the account, along with a formal letter confirming the dates and amounts of each withdrawal, and she recommended gently that I consider removing my mother as an authorized signer immediately, a process that took less than 20 minutes once I decided to move forward with it. I remember signing that paperwork with a strange, hollow feeling in my chest, understanding that I was closing a door that had been quietly, invisibly open for 6 years, without my knowledge, a door that had cost me, in the end, considerably more than I had ever imagined possible. I did not confront my family again immediately. I want to explain why, because I think it matters. I spent the following 2 weeks doing something my mother, in her explanation to me, had essentially predicted I would eventually do. I set a boundary. But I set it carefully, methodically, gathering everything I needed before I ever said another word about it out loud. I requested, through Patricia's office, a complete history of every transaction on that account going back the full 6 years of its existence, not because I suspected anything further, but because I wanted a complete, uncontestable record before I ever sat down with my family again. I compiled it all into a single document, chronological, clearly labeled, showing every deposit I had personally made, every dollar of overtime and skipped vacation that had built that account from $200 to nearly $47,000, alongside the 5 withdrawals that had reduced it, in a matter of 5 weeks, to just over $4,000. I also, during those 2 weeks, had a conversation with Tyler directly, the first time we had spoken since everything came to light. He called me, hesitant, his voice carrying none of its usual bravado, and he told me he hadn't known, at least not fully, how much of my money our mother had actually used. I remember sitting on my balcony during that call, watching the traffic move slowly along the street below, letting the silence stretch between his sentences rather than filling it the way I might once have, out of some old habit of smoothing things over for him before he'd even finished saying what he needed to say. He told me about the weeks after the bail payment, the second creditor who'd surfaced almost as soon as the first debt was settled, a smaller, more informal arrangement he'd made with someone he described only as a guy from work. A debt he'd been too embarrassed to mention to anyone until it, too, became urgent. He told me about the apartment search, rushed and anxious, our mother handling the deposit and first month's rent, while he focused on simply staying employed and out of further legal trouble. He knew about the bail. He said he hadn't asked questions about where the additional money for his new apartment and the second debt had come from. And when I asked him directly whether that was because he genuinely didn't know, or because he'd simply preferred not to know, he was quiet for a long moment before admitting quietly that it was probably closer to the second explanation. I think some part of me knew Mom wasn't just pulling that kind of money out of nowhere, he said, his voice cracking slightly in a way I hadn't heard from him since we were teenagers. I just didn't let myself think too hard about where it was actually coming from, because I already felt terrible enough without adding that on top of it. I appreciated the honesty, even as it complicated the simple story I might have preferred to tell myself, the one where my mother was entirely responsible and my brother was entirely innocent. The truth, as it usually is in families like mine, was messier than that. I invited my mother and Tyler to dinner at my apartment, 3 weeks after that first devastating phone call, and I asked Marcus to be present, not to speak for me, but simply so that I wouldn't have to carry the full emotional weight of that conversation entirely alone. My mother arrived first, bringing a dish she hadn't been asked to bring, the kind of small performative gesture people make when they're hoping food might soften a conversation they know is coming. She set the dish down on my kitchen counter without quite meeting my eyes, and I noticed her glancing, briefly, at the folder of printed statements I had left sitting on the table, before quickly looking away again, as though acknowledging it directly might make whatever was coming feel more real than she was prepared for. Tyler arrived a few minutes later, quieter than I had seen him in years, sitting on the edge of my couch, as though he weren't entirely certain he had the right to take up more space than that, his knee bouncing slightly in a nervous rhythm I recognized from childhood, back when he was waiting outside the principal's office for a conversation he already knew wasn't going to go well. I did not raise my voice through any of what followed. I had decided, in the 2 weeks of preparation leading up to that dinner, that I would not let this conversation become the kind of loud, chaotic argument that had characterized so many family conflicts throughout my childhood. Arguments that always seemed to end with everyone exhausted and nothing actually resolved. I wanted instead something calmer, something built entirely on what had actually, verifiably happened. I laid the certified bank statements on my kitchen table, the same table where I had sat alone at nearly 2 a.m. 3 weeks earlier, piecing together the full scope of what had happened. I walked my mother and Tyler through it, slowly, factually, the explicit $12,000 loan I had agreed to, followed by 4 additional withdrawals totaling $32,000 that I had never discussed, never approved, and never even been informed about until I discovered them myself. My mother started to offer the same explanation she'd given me over the phone, the mounting threats, the second debt, the need for a new apartment, and I let her finish before I responded, because I wanted her to hear her own explanation laid alongside the actual numbers rather than interrupting her defensiveness before it had fully formed. I noticed as she spoke that her hands stayed folded tightly in her lap, and she looked, more than once, toward the folder of statements, rather than at my face directly, as though the paper itself carried an authority she couldn't quite bring herself to meet eye to eye. When she finished, I said, quietly, "I understand that Tyler was in real danger, and I understand you were frightened. I would have helped if you had asked me directly, the same way I helped with the bail. What I can't understand, and what I need you to actually sit with tonight, is why you decided, 4 separate times, that the right response to being frightened was to access my account without telling me, rather than simply calling me and asking, the way you did the first time." My mother's eyes filled with tears, and she said, "I was going to tell you eventually, Emma. I just wanted to wait until things had calmed down." I told her, as gently as I could manage while still being entirely honest, that intention doesn't change the fact that for 5 weeks she had allowed me to continue planning a wedding, tasting cake samples, meeting with vendors, entirely unaware that the fund I had spent 6 years building had been reduced to less than 10% of what it had held when I made that first, explicit loan. I told her that the harm wasn't only financial, though the financial harm was significant and real. The harm was that I had spent 5 weeks trusting a version of my family's honesty that, it turned out, hadn't actually existed for most of that time. Tyler, to his credit, spoke next, and what he said surprised me. He said, "I think I let myself not ask questions because asking questions would have meant admitting how bad I'd let things get, again, and having to actually feel guilty about what that meant for you specifically, instead of just being grateful the immediate problem went away." It wasn't a full apology, not exactly, but it was, I think, the most honest thing my brother had said to me in years. And I recognized, hearing it, the particular kind of avoidance that had characterized so much of his adult life, the pattern of letting immediate relief outweigh any real reckoning with consequences. I told them both, calmly, what I needed to happen next. I needed a written, signed repayment agreement with a realistic but firm timeline for the full $32,000 taken without my consent, separate entirely from the original $12,000 loan, which I was willing to keep on its original informal terms given that it had, at least, been explicitly discussed and agreed to beforehand. I told them I had already removed my mother as an authorized signer on the account, and that this was not a punishment, but simply the correction of an oversight I should have addressed years earlier, long before any of this happened. My mother agreed quietly to the repayment plan, though I want to be honest with you that, as of the recording of this story, that repayment has been slow, inconsistent, arriving in amounts smaller and less frequent than what we originally agreed to. I have learned in the months since that a signed agreement doesn't automatically undo decades of financial patterns, and I have had to decide repeatedly how much energy I am willing to spend enforcing consequences for people I still, despite everything, genuinely love. There have been specific moments in those months that have tested my resolve more than others. A payment that arrived 3 weeks late with no explanation until I sent a brief, neutral text asking about it, prompting an apologetic call the following day, and a payment that arrived within the hour, as though the simple act of my asking directly, rather than waiting patiently the way I once might have, was enough to remind my mother that the old pattern of quiet, indefinite postponement no longer applied. A conversation with an aunt at a cousin's baby shower, who mentioned, carefully, that she'd heard there'd been some tension over money, phrased vaguely enough that I understood my mother had shared some softened version of events with the wider family, a version that likely cast the situation as an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than what the certified bank statements actually showed. I did not correct my aunt's understanding that day. I have learned slowly that not every version of the story needs to be corrected in every room. Some battles are worth having. Others are simply worth knowing you have the paperwork for, whether or not you ever need to produce it again. There was one particular month, the fourth since our agreement, when no payment arrived at all, and I found myself sitting with a familiar, uncomfortable choice, whether to let it pass quietly the way I had let so many smaller things pass throughout my life, or to address it directly and risk the same old accusations of being difficult, of not understanding how hard things still were for Tyler, of caring more about money than about family. I chose that time to send a short, calm email rather than a phone call, laying out the missed payment plainly, attaching the original signed agreement for reference, and asking simply when I could expect it to be corrected. The payment arrived 4 days later, along with a brief, slightly defensive message from my mother about how tight things had been that particular month. I did not respond to the defensiveness. I simply confirmed receipt of the payment and moved on, understanding, more clearly with each of these small exchanges, that consistency, not confrontation, was going to be the real, ongoing work of protecting what that agreement was meant to protect. What the confrontation did accomplish, more than the money itself, was something I think mattered even more in the long run. It established clearly, undeniably on paper, that what had happened to me was not a reasonable family sacrifice I should simply absorb with grace. It was a boundary violation, documented, time-stamped, and impossible to reframe as anything gentler than what it actually was. Marcus and I did get married, 3 months later, exactly on schedule, though not in the venue I had originally hoped for. We scaled back significantly, a smaller ceremony at his parents' backyard rather than the boutique event space I'd toured with such excitement that spring. A decision that, I want to tell you honestly, still occasionally stings when I think about the wedding I had originally planned for 6 careful years. The morning of the ceremony, getting dressed in his childhood bedroom rather than the bridal suite I had once imagined, I caught myself, briefly, mourning the version of that day I'd pictured for years. The string lights over a lake, the venue coordinator I'd grown genuinely fond of during our planning calls, the cake we'd tasted together on that Saturday afternoon that already felt, by then, like it belonged to a different life entirely. But I also want to tell you that the ceremony we actually had, smaller, simpler, paid for entirely through what remained of my savings and a modest contribution from Marcus that he insisted on making without any hesitation, felt, in its own way, more honest than the version I had originally imagined. His mother strung the same lights,